She counted it out in worn bills on the tailgate of a stranger's truck. Every dollar she had left in the world, smoothed flat and stacked careful. Savings it had taken her 9 hard years to scrape back together. And she handed it over for a motorcycle that would not start, would not shine, would not do one single thing but sit there, rusting in the Central Valley sun. The men around the swap meet watched a tiny 79-year-old woman in a cardigan trade her last penny for a broken-down shovelhead that nobody else there would have hauled away for free, and most of them figured the poor old thing had lost her marbles. She had not. She had found something. She had found the only thing in this world she had ever truly wanted back. And what 80 Hells Angels were about to do when they learned why that old woman bought that broken bike is the kind of thing that restores your faith in people for a year. The swap meet sprawled across the dusty fairgrounds outside a small California town. A few acres of folding tables and truck beds and tarps, where men with grease under their nails came from 300 miles around to buy and sell motorcycle parts, basket cases, project bikes, and lies. It was a Saturday in the dry gold heat, the air smelling of hot dust and old engine oil and the carne asada off the food truck. The whole place loud with haggling, and the occasional bark of a motor someone was trying to prove still ran. Hell's Angels were thick on the ground that weekend. A couple of the local charters had stalls selling parts, and dozens more had ridden in just to walk the rows the way anyone does, looking for the one piece they'd been hunting for years. It was a rough, friendly, churning kind of place, the sort of place where everybody minds their own business and nobody much notices a little old lady moving slow down the aisles. Nobody, that is, until she stopped at the worst bike in the whole meet and would not move on. Among the men running a part stall that morning was a Hell's Angel everyone called Wrench, because for 30 years he had been the best builder in his charter. A big quiet man in his late 50s with forearms like fence posts and an eye that could read a motor like other men read a newspaper. He'd noticed the old woman drift past his table twice. And he'd noticed she wasn't shopping the way people shop. She wasn't looking for parts. She was looking for something, scanning the rows of bikes with a kind of desperate hope that didn't belong on a face that old. He didn't think much of it. People come to those meets carrying all kinds of things. He went back to his carburetors. He had no idea that in about 20 minutes that old woman was going to break his heart and rearrange his whole weekend, and the weekends of about 79 other men besides. Before we go on, do me a kindness, hit subscribe, and drop your hometown in the comments below, wherever you're listening from in this world today. I read every single one. Now stay close, because the reason that old woman emptied her savings for a bike that wouldn't run is the kind of reason that brings grown men to their knees. Her name was Opal Greer, and she was 79 years old, and she had been alone in the world for 9 of those years, ever since the morning she'd woken up beside a cold space in the bed where her husband Gene used to be. She and Gene had been married 53 years. He'd been a quiet man, a machinist, not a club man, not a wild man, just a steady fellow who loved 2 things on this earth with his whole heart, Opal, and the motorcycle he'd bought as a skinny 20-year-old and spent the next 40 years rebuilding, piece by piece, in the garage off the back of their little house. That shovelhead was Gene Greer's life's work and his joy. He'd bought it as a wreck for $40 when he was 20 and spent the next 4 decades making it perfect, 1 paycheck and 1 weekend at a time. He'd machined parts for it with his own hands when he couldn't afford to buy them. He knew every bolt on it by feel in the dark. He'd painted the tank himself, a deep blue Opal had always loved. Opal Blue, he called it. And under the clear coat he had hand-lettered her name in gold script, small and careful, so that every mile he rode he carried her with him. He had engraved their wedding date on a little brass plate under the seat. On Sunday afternoons for 40 years, he'd taken Opal on the back of that bike out into the foothills, her arms around his middle and her cheek against his back, and those rides were some of the happiest hours of her whole long life. The wind, the warm smell of him and the engine, the whole green world rolling by. Just the two of them, and nowhere they had to be. He'd always promised her one more big ride, a real trip, the coast highway. Someday when there was time and a little money. There never quite was. And then there wasn't going to be. When Jean died, he left Opal with more love than any woman deserves, and a mountain of medical bills and funeral costs that a machinist's small savings could not begin to cover. She was 70 and frightened and drowning, and there was only one thing in that house worth real money. And so Opal Greer did the hardest thing she had ever done in her life. She sold Jean's motorcycle. She sold the bike his hands had built, the bike with her name in gold under the clear coat, to a dealer who gave her enough to bury her husband and keep her house. She'd asked the dealer, with what little pride she had left, to please find it a good home, to someone who'd ride it right. And the dealer had nodded the way they nod, and she'd known even then it was just a number on a sheet to him. She stood in the driveway in her housecoat and watched a stranger winch it up onto a trailer and chain it down where Jean's hands had never let a chain touch it, and drive it away down the street. And she felt like she was watching the last of Jean leave the world a second time. The house went quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. She had regretted it every single day since. There was one thing she had not been able to give up, though: the key. When the dealer took the bike, Opal had quietly slipped the key off the ring and kept it. A useless little key to a bike she no longer owned. And for 9 years, she had carried it on her own keyring everywhere she went. The way you keep a thing that's all you have left. And for 9 years, in the slow, careful way of a woman with more time than money, Opal Greer had been searching. She'd learned to use the library computer. She'd scanned the online listings and the auction sites, looking for a deep blue shovelhead, looking for her own name in gold script, hoping against all hope to find Jean's bike before she died and buy it back so it wouldn't end its days in some stranger's hands. She'd saved a few dollars at a time out of a fixed income that barely stretched. 9 years of skipped comforts, until she had a little envelope of cash for the day she finally found it. And 3 weeks before that swap meet, on the library computer, in a blurry photo of a sad, neglected project bike, she had seen the ghost of gold lettering under 9 years of grime and bad treatment. And she had known. She'd taken a bus, and then another bus to get to that fairgrounds, and there it was, at the end of a row, broken and filthy and beautiful, Jean's bike, come back to her at last. The man selling it had bought it as a flipper, run it into the ground, swapped on whatever cheap parts came to hand, and finally given up. It didn't run. The wiring was a rat's nest. Half the parts were wrong, and he was glad to be rid of it at any price. He had no idea what he had. To him it was a dead project taking up space in his truck. To Opal, walking up to it at the end of that row, it was the whole of her former life standing in the dust. She'd known it from 20 feet, known the lines of it, the way you know the shape of someone you love from across a crowd. And then she'd gotten close and seen, under 9 years of grime and a bad amateur clear coat, the faintest ghost of gold lettering on the blue, and her legs had nearly gone out from under her, right there in the aisle. Opal didn't haggle. She couldn't have if she'd wanted to. She didn't trust her voice. She just opened her envelope with shaking hands and counted out every dollar she had onto his tailgate. All of it. The whole 9 years of saving, smoothing each worn bill flat for a bike she could not ride and could not fix and could barely push. Because it was Jean's, because his hands had made it, because her name was under the clear coat, and because she would rather have it broken in her living room than perfect in a stranger's garage for one more day. That was when Wrench, walking past with a box of parts, heard the seller mutter a joke to his buddy about the crazy old lady who'd just paid project money for a paperweight. And Wrench stopped and turned around and asked the old woman, gentle as he knew how, why on earth she wanted that particular broken-down bike. And Opal Greer, standing there with her empty envelope and her hand resting on the filthy blue tank, told him. She told him about Jean and the 40 years and the gold letters with her name and the Sunday rides into the foothills and the morning she woke up alone and the driveway and the trailer and the key she'd kept for 9 years on her ring. She told it simply, without a tear, the way people tell the truest things, and by the time she was done the seller had gone quiet, and 3 other men had stopped to listen, and Wrench, the best builder in his charter, a man who did not cry, had to look away across the dusty rows and clear his throat hard. "Ma'am," he said when he could talk. "Can I look at something?" And he crouched down by that ruined bike and rubbed his thumb across the grimy tank. And there, under the dirt and the dull oxidation, faded but real, was a single word in gold script. Opal. Wrench knelt there in the dust and looked at her name on her dead husband's gas tank. And he made a decision. And then he stood up and started making phone calls. He didn't tell Opal what the calls were about. He just thanked her and told her not to go anywhere, and asked a couple of the younger brothers to help the old woman get the bike loaded and to take down where she lived. She thought they were being kind to a confused old lady. She had no idea she had just set something enormous in motion. By that afternoon, the story had gone all the way around the swap meet. The way a story like that does, passed man to man down the rows. The old woman, the last savings, the husband's bike, the name in gold, the key she'd carried 9 years. And by the time the sun went down, a thing had quietly organized itself among the 80-some Hells Angels at that fairgrounds, the way the best things in that brotherhood always organize themselves, without a meeting or a vote, just a look past between men who already know. They were going to fix Jean Greer's bike, not patch it, not get it running. They were going to restore it, every nut and bolt, to better than the day it rolled out of Jean's garage, and they were not going to let that old woman pay one thin dime, because she'd already paid everything she had. What followed was 6 weeks that the men involved would talk about for the rest of their lives. Wrench took the bike to his shop, and the Brotherhood descended on it. Word went out to the charters, and the parts came in. Correct shovelhead pieces from collections all over the state. A man in Sacramento who had the exact right tank emblem and wouldn't take $1 for it once he heard why. A brother in Fresno who tracked down date, correct everything down to the right year of carburetor. A retired painter who came out of retirement just for this. They worked nights after their day jobs. They worked weekends. Men who'd never met Opal Greer drove 2 hours each way to spend a Saturday turning wrenches on a stranger's husband's motorcycle, and counted it a privilege. They machined what they couldn't buy. They polished chrome until their hands cramped, and then polished it more. The paint man matched that deep opal blue off a clean spot under the seat, exact, and hand-lettered her name back in gold, brighter than ever, the way Jean had done it half a century before. And when he was finished, he stood back and had to step outside for a minute. And the whole time, a few of them took turns quietly looking in on Opal herself, fixing things she'd never asked about. The sagging porch step, the leaking faucet, the gutters Jean used to handle, a screen door that had hung crooked for years. Because once they'd seen how that old woman was living, alone and proud and scraping by on almost nothing, fixing the bike alone had started to feel like nowhere near enough. 6 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon, Opal Greer heard a sound she had not heard in 9 years. Engines. They came up her quiet street and filled it curb to curb. 80 Hell's Angels rolling slow, and in the middle of them, on a trailer behind Wrench's truck, under a sheet, was something Opal could not yet see. She came out onto her newly fixed porch in her cardigan, bewildered, as 80 men shut down their bikes in front of her little house, and Wrench walked up her path with his cap in his hands and asked her, would she come down to the curb? There was something they wanted to show her. And they pulled the sheet off. And there in the California sun stood Jean's motorcycle, whole, gleaming, perfect. The deep opal blue blazing, and her name in fresh gold script down the tank, more beautiful than the day her husband finished it. Every inch of it restored by the hands of 80 strangers who had heard an old woman's story and decided it would not end the way it was going to end. Opal Greer put both hands over her mouth and her knees went, and Wrench caught her arm, and she stood there shaking, staring at the impossible thing in front of her, unable to make a single sound. There's one more thing, Wrench said softly. We couldn't find the key. The ignition's the original. We kept it that way on purpose. We figured maybe you still had it. And Opal Greer reached into her cardigan pocket with a trembling hand and brought out the little key she had carried for 9 years. The key to a bike she no longer owned, worn smooth from 9 years of her thumb, and she held it out, and she could not speak. Wrench took it from her gentle as anything and crouched by the bike and slid it into her dead husband's motorcycle. And he looked up at her once, and then he turned it. And that shovelhead caught and roared to life in the street, the exact sound, the very sound. The deep familiar rumble that Opal had not heard since the last morning. Jean rode it down this same street 9 years and a lifetime ago, and the sound rolled off the little houses and filled the whole block, and Opal Greer broke completely, her hand pressed to her mouth, weeping the way a person weeps when something they were certain was gone forever turns out not to be. 80 hard men stood in the road around her with their eyes streaming and did not bother to hide it. Because there are some sounds that undo even the men who think nothing can undo them, and the sound of a good man's engine running again under his widow's hand is one of them. But they were not done. Because Opal had told Wrench, somewhere in those 6 weeks, about the one more ride Jean always promised her and never got to take, the coast, the real trip, someday. And so Wrench helped her up onto the back of her husband's restored bike, settled her arms around the brother who'd ride her, and 80 Hell's Angels escorted Opal Greer all the way to the Pacific that afternoon, out to the coast highway Jean had promised her for 50 years. The wind in her white hair and the engine she thought she'd lost forever singing underneath her at last. She rode the ride. She finally rode the ride. It changed her life, the way the title of every true story like this promises and so rarely delivers. The bike came home, not to a cold garage, but right into her living room, where she could see it from her chair and touch it every single day, her name in gold catching the lamplight. But more than the bike, those 80 men did not ride off and forget her. They'd become something to her in 6 weeks, and she to them, and they kept coming. There were Sunday visits and then Sunday dinners. There were birthdays nobody had remembered in years, suddenly remembered by dozens. There was a fridge that stopped being empty, and a porch light that somebody always seemed to have checked, and a phone that rang just to ask how she was keeping. A woman who had spent 9 years alone in a too-quiet house woke up one day to find she had 100 sons and grandsons. Men who fought over who got to drive her to her appointments. Men who taught her the names of all their kids. The last savings she'd spent on a broken bike had bought her, in the end, the one thing she'd been missing even more than Jean's shovelhead. She was not alone anymore, and she never would be again. Opal Greer lived out her remaining years rich in the only way that has ever counted for anything. And when at last she passed, peaceful and surrounded and unafraid, 80 motorcycles led her to her rest beside Jean, and the deep blue shovelhead with her name in gold rolled at the very head of the procession, its engine the last sound over her grave. People will tell you that money can't buy the things that matter, and that's true as far as it goes. But every so often somebody spends their very last dollar on something that looks worthless to the whole world. A broken-down old machine, a piece of someone they lost, and a handful of strangers see it for what it really is, and they answer it with the only currency that's ever truly changed a life. Not money, not even a beautiful restored motorcycle, just this, the decision, made freely by people who owed her nothing, that one lonely old woman was not going to be left to face the rest of it by herself. That's what 80 Hells Angels did, and that's what changed her life forever. If this story reached you today, if you believe that the things that look worthless to the world are sometimes the most precious things there are, and that there are still people who will answer a stranger's grief with their own two hands, give it a like and share it with someone who needs reminding. Subscribe so you never miss the next story. And down in the comments, tell me where you're watching from, and tell me about the one thing you'd spend your very last dollar to get back.